All right. So we've discussed how individual earnings evolve over time, and they're driven by factors like education, experience, and diminishing human capital investments over time. But these individual patterns don't exist in isolation. They combine across workers and across the entire economy to shape broader earnings distributions across the entire labor market. Now, what we're going to do is zoom out and we're going to look at the bigger picture, how earnings vary across workers at a single point in time, and what factors contribute to this variation. Questions like why do some workers earn significantly more than others? And how do education, training, or unionization affect wage inequality? This brings us to the topic of the earnings distribution. Differences in human capital accumulation, job characteristics, and career choices lead to variation in earnings among workers of the same age or the same education level. For example, some workers invest more in education, while others gain specialized skills on the job. This creates diverse wage outcomes. The income distribution often has what we call a right skewed shape, meaning that people earning in the lower to middle ranges, and then there's a long tail representing the high income earners. So there are a lot of people earning on the low side and kind of in the middle. And then on the high side, there's very, very few people. But some of them earn a lot, so it really stretches out to the right. It's America, so the people on the left side of the income distribution live a good life compared to the rest of the world. But at the same time, they earn a lot less than people way out on the right tail, those really high earners. Now, this doesn't show the whole picture. Remember, it's just a snapshot. This is one period in time. And for each worker, there's going to be a lot of movement over time. Remember with that age earnings profile, you start out very low, but then quickly increase your wages over time. So for instance, there's a lot of younger workers down here on this end of the photo. Over time, as they get older, they're going to move up here. They may not be the highest earners when they're starting out down here, but they will move up in this direction. So this kind of overstates the amount of inequality in society in general or in the labor market. But it is important to note that 40% of workers will be in the top 10% of income earners for at least 1 year in their working life. So there is quite a bit of movement up and down throughout the income distribution over time. We aren't Europe after all. People aren't destined to spend their entire career in their same life in the same place on the income distribution in the same place and the whole social standing in their society. People move up and down all the time. Families are always rising and falling in America. So wage differentials exist due to two main factors that we're going to talk about: human capital investments. And these are going to vary from worker to worker, talking about education and then even training on the job. Both of those can be used by workers to develop their human capital in a way that makes them more productive. More productive workers tend to earn more money. There's also going to be age differences. Younger workers are still accumulating that human capital, while older workers have already built up all those skills and experience. And at this point, they're collecting the returns from earlier investments. Now, there is a positive correlation between ability and human capital investments. So this is going to kind of stretch out those wages and it's going to spread out that income inequality and create the income inequality. Now, one way that we measure income inequality in a society, whether it's at the state level, the national level, however, is the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is simply a number between 0 and 1 that measures income inequality. For the coefficient 0, that means perfect equality. Everyone in society earns the exact same amount of money. And 1 means perfect inequality. There is one person who earns everything and everyone else earns literally nothing. Both of these are very hard to imagine in the real world, and every other society lands somewhere between those two extremes. The Gini coefficient is a common tool to compare income inequality across countries or over time. So on the graph here, you have this straight diagonal graph here. This is very important. This is perfect equality, where every single worker earns the same amount of income. The Gini coefficient measures how much the actual income distribution curve deviates from this line. So this actual Lorenz curve right here, this is the actual line for net income distribution in society. This line right here is the perfect theoretic, perfect equality one. This difference, this shaded area right here, is going to be the Gini coefficient. Now, the more it deviates, the farther this line stretches from this perfect equality line, the more unequal the income distribution is in society. So the more it deviates, the higher the Gini coefficient and the greater the inequality. In the US, the Gini coefficient is relatively high compared to other developed countries, which means there's a wider gap between the high income earners and the low income earners. However, anytime you're comparing across countries, it's going to be difficult to get the numbers exactly right. And often these measures don't count government transfers, especially the people on the lower end of the income distribution. Once we include them, the US actually has a lower Gini coefficient than many other countries, which is pretty surprising. Whether you're on the right or the left, um, either side, whether you're really concerned about income equality or don't care about income inequality, both of those people tend to be surprised when they hear that the US has lower Gini coefficient than most other countries once we count government transfers. So there's two ways to measure income inequality. There's two different gaps that we look at besides just using the Gini coefficient. So we'll compare workers in what we call the 90-10 wage gap and the 50-10 wage gap. Now, the 90-10 wage gap measures a difference in wages between earners in the 90th percentile, these really, really high income earners, and those in the 10th percentile, the really, really low income earners. So this gives a sense of the overall inequality of the labor market, showing how large the gap is between the top earners and the bottom earners. This highlights the broad inequality and can show how much the top earners can pull away from the rest of the workforce, how extreme their income can get. We can also use the 50-10 wage gap, and this focuses on the wage difference between the 50th percentile, so these are the median earners, people right in the middle, and the 10th percentile, the lowest income earners. So this reflects income inequality, particularly at the lower end of the wage distribution. This is really useful for understanding challenges faced by low-income workers. Instead of comparing them to the highest workers, we're comparing them to someone in about the middle, the average worker, to see how big that difference is. This can reveal how well the labor market supports lower-income workers compared to just the average worker. If the 90-10 wage gap in, let's say, a company is large, it means there's a big gap between the highest paid and the lowest paid workers. So this may be a sign of a lack of upward mobility within a company. If we take this and look at the societal level, look at the United States, a large 90-10 wage gap suggests that there's a really large gap between the highest paid workers and the lowest paid workers. These are very different roles, and the higher earning roles, these are roles that typically would have more education requirements, require a lot more skills fewer people could do. They're probably extremely productive, making a lot of money for their firms. If there's a huge 90-10 wage gap that's very large, there's something really, really separating people at the low end of the income distribution and those at the high end of the income distribution. Over time, we've seen that the high wage earners, the top 10%, or even the top 1% of wage earners, have pulled farther ahead compared to those at the bottom, so the bottom 10% or 25% of workers. Now, this trend has been talked about quite a bit by economists or even people in the general press and politicians, and it reflects structural changes in the economy. We've undergone significant changes in the really 45 years since 1980. This has been a long time, and 1980, it was a very different world compared to 2024. So there were things like increased demand for highly skilled workers, technological advancements, and globalization, all which changed significantly since 1980 and really contributes to the current wage structure we see and the level of income inequality we're experiencing in the US today. Now, this income inequality, this growth since the 1980s is also influenced by institutional factors. So there's changes in unionization rates, minimum wage policies, tax structures, a whole bunch of different things that the government does that also leads to a change in income inequality. Wage gaps between workers with different levels of education. So think of people with a high school diploma versus someone with a bachelor's or even an advanced degree. The gaps between them have grown significantly. This reflects the increasing premium placed on higher education in a knowledge-based economy. Workers need higher education. They need to develop more skills to work in a knowledge-based economy, especially you're doing stuff with computer that you're not going to be able to get a lot of these skills currently in the high school curriculum. So you need to get more advanced education in order to be able to succeed in that economy and to earn higher wages. But this is going to have implications for the income distribution in an economy, especially when you have a bunch of people that aren't receiving college degrees. So another thing to consider is that workers with more experience tend to earn more. But this premium has widened across industries as some reward those more specialized skills more than others. Like we talked about already, age groups see a disparity. So younger workers are facing lower wages than older, more established workers. So here we see the earnings income inequality shown by the Gini coefficient over time. This is 1937 to 2005, so it's a little out of date. But still, what we see is the Gini coefficient starting somewhat high in the late 1930s, and then through the 40s and 50s into the 60s and even the 70s, we see it slowly and steadily decline. From there, going through the early 2000s, it increases fairly sharply again. So we see these changes because of how much the economy has changed. Think of how different the world was in 1937 compared to 2005 and even 2005 to today. Now, this change in income inequality has no simple explanation. It would be really nice and neat if I could tell you a story of one big thing that changed and suddenly this threw everything out of whack. But in reality, there's a lot of different things going on, many factors that interact in unfortunately complex ways. So, luckily for us, we don't need to be an expert in this. We're just talking about trends. So I'll give you a little bit of the background on some of these things that have been changing and contributing to the growth in income inequality in the US since, say, the 1960s. So, for example, we've seen changes in technology, increased globalization, and different labor market policies, and all of these play a role. Even just isolating the individual impacts of one of those, holding everything else constant, can be challenging. So it's difficult for economists to try to estimate the specific effect of changes in any one of these categories. So economic fundamentals include things like technological advances, globalization, shifts in industry, so maybe decline in manufacturing, the rise of more high-tech firms. Labor market institutions refer to things like unions, minimum wage policies, employment laws, occupational licensing laws. These may have weakened in their ability to balance wage distributions over time. Remember, we talked about labor unions, about how they decreased income inequality within the labor union. They kept the wages kind of compressed together, putting downward pressure on higher earners' wages and putting upward pressure on lower earners' wages. These factors I just mentioned didn't act in isolation. They happened all at the same time, kind of reinforcing each other in a way. So technological changes like automation, computerization, and now the rise of AI potentially have created a skills bias. So workers with advanced skills or higher education are increasingly in demand and earning really high salaries because they're so productive, while jobs requiring fewer skills are becoming less common, and we're seeing downward pressure on their wages because there's more people able to work those jobs than there are jobs to go around. This shift is going to increase wages for skilled workers, and that's what we've seen, while stagnating or even lowering wages for unskilled workers. Increased physical capital helps to increase the productivity of skilled workers. Physical capital includes things like machines, tools, and technologies that are going to enhance worker productivity. For instance, a data scientist with advanced software or a surgeon with robotic tools can do much more. They can produce much more than their counterparts that don't have these types of resources. Even in things like automobile manufacturing, you have a lot more mechanization and a lot more technology being used in the production process that increases the productivity of auto workers. These skills tend to disproportionately benefit skilled workers in whatever industry they're taking place in. This creates a feedback loop of higher productivity and higher wages for those workers, but you don't see those gains for other workers. A decrease in the supply of skilled workers or an increase in the demand for skilled workers could cause a widening of the wage gap. In this case, if the supply of the skilled workers don't keep up with demand, wages for these workers naturally rise due to the competition among employers. Conversely, an oversupply of unskilled workers relative to demand is going to suppress their wages. These two things, if they happen simultaneously, can really increase income inequality. The downward sloping demand curve in this figure here suggests that when the wage of skilled workers rises, employers will want to hire few of them. This is the basic, or one of the basic takeaways from our supply and demand framework. Here we have a supply curve that's perfectly inelastic. So we're saying no matter what, we're not going to have a change in total supply of workers. That's all the workers we have right now. So it shows that the number of skilled workers is fixed at that point, whatever that number is. In this case, it's P0 for the supply curve, S0. Initially, the labor market is in equilibrium at point A. Now, if the relative supply of skilled workers increases to S1, the only way to explain the increase in the relative wage of skilled workers is if there was a significant shift in the demand curve, say from D0 to D1, leading to a new equilibrium at point C. So, for example, let's think about this in the tech industry now. So as technology becomes more important, firms demand more skilled workers, but the supply of skilled workers may not be able to keep up immediately, pushing wages up higher. So you have an increase in supply in the short term, but the increase in supply isn't enough to keep up with the increase in demand. So maybe firms want to hire, let's say throughout the entire economy, 10,000 more workers, but the supply only increases to say 5,000 more workers. What's going to happen with that shortage of workers where we don't have enough to fill the demand that firms have? That's going to push up the wages of those highly skilled workers as firms compete with each other to hire these workers and try to poach them from one another. Now, over time, if more people pursue relevant education or training, supply of skilled workers will increase even more and get us back to the point, where the wage isn't naturally increasing. You push it back so it stays the same as it was at point A. But this can explain what's going on, especially in the short term, for why we see an increase in income inequality. If firms demand for highly skilled workers, workers understand technology, if that increases faster than the supply of those workers that, in that time, then we're going to see that push up their wages even more. So not only are they highly productive, so they're earning high wages, but then there's a relative shortage of those workers, which pushes up their wages even higher and contributes to income inequality. Now, wage inequality has increased over the past few decades for several reasons. Your textbook just lists out a whole bunch of them. So here are the things that we need to consider. Here are some of these possibilities, some of the important ones. One is supply shifts. The supply of skilled workers has increased more slowly than the demand for these skilled workers. There's this sort of skills mismatch where we don't have all the workers or the skills that firms want. So this is partly due to educational changes. More people are completing higher education, but not at the same rate that employers are seeking skilled workers. And a lot of people going to higher education, getting a college degree, may not be getting the degree and building the skills that firms really want to complement these technological changes. So the demand for this skilled labor with those specific skills that firms want, it's not just any degree, it's a degree in a relevant field. This gap pushes wages upward, and it ends up widening the wage gap as well because some of these workers are earning so much more. Another thing to consider is international trade. Globalization and international trade have led to an increase in demand for certain types of skills, particularly those related to technology, to finance, and other of these high demand, highly skilled fields. At the same time, the supply of less skilled labor from countries with lower wage levels has increased. So this has put downward pressure on the wages of unskilled workers in the US. At the same time, we've had this pressure pushing up wages of highly skilled workers. We have these pushing in the opposite direction at the same time, and this has widened income inequality in the wage distribution. We also have skills-based technological change. Kind of an odd term. What this means is that advancements in technology don't affect all workers equally. It doesn't increase all their productivity the same, and it doesn't change firms' demand for those workers in the same exact way. Some workers are much more efficient, much more productive, thus much more valuable to firms, and they earn higher wages. Other workers are not. They're either being replaced by technology or it just doesn't complement them and make them more productive. So this, again, increases the demand for skilled workers who can operate and maintain these technologies while making other less skilled jobs less valuable or even obsolete. As a result, the wages of skilled workers have increased compared to those with less education or less experience. Again, another way that we're pushing these wages in opposite directions for high income earners and lower income earners. We've also seen a number of institutional changes in the United States labor market, changes in policies and regulations, both at the state and federal level, and even at the city level. So, like the declines of unions or the introduction of minimum wage laws or even occupational licensing, they impact how wages are determined. So, for example, declining union membership means that fewer workers can collectively bargain for higher wages, which contributes to wage inequality. Although unions continue to play an important role in some sectors, their influence has declined over the past few decades. And we talked about that wage dispersion, which unions kind of push together, collapsing the highest earners and the lowest earners, kind of like, closer to each other. As unions begin to fade, we're seeing them spread out again. Changes in minimum wage laws, especially over time, can have significant impact on the wage structure, pushing up the lower end of the wage distribution if minimum wages increase. We haven't seen increases in the federal minimum wage over the long term, although we have seen some states and especially some cities increase in the minimum wage in their areas. But for a lot of workers, we haven't seen the pressure from increases in minimum wages increasing the wages that they earn. And finally, occupational licensing. This is talked about a lot less, but myself and a few of my colleagues have a paper that we're writing on this. So the increased occupational licensing requirements, which require workers in certain professions to have a license to work, can also contribute to wage inequality. Think of occupational licensing intuitively of being kind of like unions, but for the service sector instead of for manufacturing. It's that sort of protection, although it can have the opposite effect. So it will, the rise in occupational licensing kind of pushed up wages on the higher end for a lot of these professions with onerous licensing requirements. Things like physicians or lawyers or other healthcare providers, like even like physical therapists or occupational therapists, or increasing the education that they're required to get before they're able to enter the field, puts this restriction on their supply, but increases their wages. So all these combined to create a significant widening of the gap between low-skilled and high-skilled workers, contributing to the overall increase in wage inequality that we've seen over the past 60 or 70 years. Now, with this, I'll bring the semester to a close, and this will end our discussion on wage inequality. So I'd like to thank you all for joining me this semester as we went through labor economics together. Some of you may have enjoyed it less than others, I'll say to be polite to myself. But I hope that all of you found these concepts useful and you'll be able to apply them in your career in human resources. It's kind of tricky trying to balance the theory work with some of the practical applications that you'll be able to take with you and use in your career to make this really valuable. Going back to the chapter on education, I don't want this to be purely signaling. I want this to help develop human capital as well. So hopefully you made it through this course without too much of a headache. Now, because you're coming to the end of lecture, this means it's about time for the final exam. So please reach out to me if you have any concerns, but you also have a review sheet to help you with the topics that we're going to be covering on the exam.